How many creative videos have you seen that started off supposedly giving you advice, but end up just telling you that you're not special? This isn't that. Well, not necessarily, but I do want to talk about some of the self-delusions that we do have when we start working on whatever our creative projects are. A lot of creators walk around with this sense that they are burdened with this glorious purpose, and everything that they do, everything that they create is them manifesting or fulfilling whatever that purpose might be. Because of that, they struggle with one of the most important parts of the creative process, editing. And that's what I want to talk about today. A lot of creators walk around with one of two dynamics that I think really hinders their work in them being able to do the most important process of creation, which is editing. One of those dynamics is what I like to call is the sunken lover. The other one is the burden of glorious purpose. Now, the sunken lover dynamic is really just my play on the sunken cost fallacy, which is the idea that because you've done something so much, because you've given something so much of yourself, that you might as well just keep doing it. Unfortunately, a lot of people incorporate this thought process into their work, and it stops them from being able to create the best possible iteration of whatever they're trying to do. The sunken lover does the exact opposite of what happened at the end of Titanic. Instead of realizing that, hey, maybe we might both go down if we end up on this plank, I'm going to still let you climb aboard. That sunken lover ideology is what stops you from letting go of things that are really not benefiting your work at all, but because you have an emotional attachment to them, you just can't see yourself letting them go. Something that I think is really important for people to recognize at the beginning of their process is your affection is not required for your work to be good. Your affection is not even required for you to put out your work. If you want to create things that other people are interacting with and criticizing, you don't want to make it all about yourself and your own personal feelings. This is why you have those older, more seasoned professionals saying, well, if you want to just make something for you, just keep it in your journal, do it in your basement. And it always sounds really harsh. It is not necessarily intended to be. It's just to let you know that once you submit things to the world, they belong to the world. And your affections, your love, even your disdain for them doesn't really matter as much when gauging quality. Annie Dillard wrote a book called The Writing Life, which I have right here. And she talks a little bit about this dynamic. She gives this example of a photographer who takes all of their shots to a more experienced photographer to sort them out in a pile between good and bad. Every year, the young photographer will bring the same shot of a landscape, and every year the older photographer would say, this isn't good. And then eventually, as a couple years went by, the older photographer eventually asks, why do you keep bringing this same photo that I keep putting in the bad pile? And the younger photographer said, because I had to climb a mountain to get it. And a lot of people operate with that mentality. Because you have done this amount of work, because you have this emotional attachment to it, because of the work that you've done, you just have to keep it in your story. You just have to keep it in your song. You just have to keep submitting that same photo over and over again, even though it doesn't really fit. That would be our sunken lover. Now for our other dynamic, and probably the most nefarious one, the people who are burdened with this glorious purpose. A lot of people are walking around as if they are prophets, like they have the New Testament, and whatever they're creating is going to save the world. A lot of us are not. Not to say some people can't create things that inspire, that transform the way a lot of people around the world think. But for the most part, what your work is just going to be either a really good quality piece of work, maybe something that a lot of people engage with, or just something that, a couple people flip the pages through or listen to and say, I like that. That's fine. This idea of glorious purpose stops us from being able to see our work for exactly what it is. And every time we see errors, every time we see things that might need to be tweaked a little bit, we think about it through the lens of, this can't be challenged because I have this biblical reverence for whatever my work is. That might work for the prophets because if they're giving us literally the word of God, then you can't really challenge that. But just for us who are creating these things of our own volition, we can be challenged, and we should be. Being good at the beginning will save you a lot of time and a lot of money. So I know a lot of creatives, when they talk about their process, they oftentimes say you got to work on it every day. You got to do it every day. If you're a writer, you got to write every day. If you're a musician, you got to practice every day. And when I think about that, I always get the thought in the back of my mind, do they have a real job? Because a lot of us do. And even though it is possible, it becomes really, really difficult with doing these things every day. Now, the value that I've realized in that is that you are practicing, you are putting forth your effort in mastering your craft. I tend to think that reading is a bit more important than writing every day, only because if you have your own limitations as a writer, especially things that you're not necessarily aware of, by reading other people's work, by reading people who have different styles than you, who have different levels of skill than you have, you're going to recognize patterns of things that you cannot do, have not done, and it'll unlock some of those blind spots that you might have. I like to think of being good at the beginning as like a game of Jenga. Now me, I'm the best Jenga player you've ever met. Best to ever do it. What I learned while playing Jenga is that if you build your tower on a faulty foundation, you could be the first person to pull a piece and you will still end up knocking it over. This is the same for storytelling. If you build your story on a loose foundation, weak ideas, a premise that doesn't really make sense, as you flesh the idea out, the rest of your story will mirror that shaky foundation. It is much easier to uproot those weak ideas from the beginning and as you go than to build your story on a shaky foundation and then wait until the final steps for it to collapse. So that brings me to my main point for this video. Edit as you go. I'm not saying after every sentence you stop and you read it 100 times to make sure your word choice and your grammar and all of that is perfect, but alternate days, alternate weeks, whatever you need to do. Figure out a process so that you don't wait until you feel like you're finished, then you begin editing, because you're going to notice a whole lot more mistakes. I myself made this mistake. When I wrote my first book, I did it by myself. I wrote the entire thing and then I went to go find an editor afterwards. Once I found an editor, I realized one, I was not done, and two, there was a whole lot that needed to be reworked in my story. Now, that meant I had to pay a lot more money than I would have had to pay if I had an editor working with me throughout the entire process. So I know this series is talking about how to release a book while you are on a budget. And the best thing you can do is to spend money early. What I mean by spend money early is get an editor at the very start of you beginning your book. There's a lot of different types of editors, but the ones that I think are the most useful and most cost efficient, especially for our budgeting folks, is a copy editor and a structural editor. So your copy editor is going to read through each line, each paragraph, every single chapter of your story. They're going to make sure that your spelling is right. They're going to make sure that your grammar is appropriate. They're going to make sure your punctuation is in all of the right places. They're going to be as granular as possible to make sure everything that's on that page is as neat, functional, and preserves whatever credibility you have as a writer before you put these things out. This will also save you a lot of time on the back end, because trying to find a spelling mistake in 100,000 words is a lot harder than trying to find a spelling mistake in 1,000 words. It's a big, big difference. And that means a lot of money that you'll have to pay them to go find it, and a lot of time you're going to have to wait before you can put your work out. A structure editor will look at larger chunks of the work, so they might look at a chapter here and say this might make sense for later on. They might look at a paragraph and say, you know what, we need to cut that, or we need to shift a couple of things around, or this idea doesn't really lead anywhere, so we might want to consider pulling it out. Now, they might not be as concerned with the word for word decisions in the story, but don't get it wrong, this is still super important, because again, when we're thinking about what ideas work, we want to think about the flow and the functionality of your story. Is the pacing going to be affected by leaving this paragraph in? Is there going to be this breakneck shift if we go from this idea to this idea without some in-between information that builds us up towards that? These are the types of criticisms and critiques that a structural editor can give you. Now, we talked about what type of editors you need, but now I think we should talk about where you can go to actually find an editor. There are a bunch of different cost-efficient ways that you can find editing just by looking online. Finding your local writers association is a great way to find editors wherever you might be. There's probably a group of people just like you working on their own stories, and they have different skills that you might not have. They also might be willing to do these things for free if you all are workshopping things together, and you can kind of bounce things off of each other. Something I realize is that we don't oftentimes make mistakes because there's something wrong with us, or it's something wrong with the way we write. We really might not recognize some of the mistakes that we make because we get so comfortable with making them. That makes it easier for other people who are not us to read these things objectively, to notice our mistakes. This also means that you might be an effective editor for someone else because you're going to be able to read their work objectively and see some of the patterns and limitations they might have. So you could do a little swap. You could go to a writers association, maybe find a partner, and you all are editing each other's work, maybe for free, maybe for a depreciated cost. You can also go to a site like Fiverr, where a bunch of people are advertising their services for editing and a whole world or other different things. You could also reach out to a university, some of their professors, and see if they might be willing or they have students who might be interested in editing. This can serve as valuable experience for those students, and it can also be a way for you to get cost-efficient editing. I'm sure you could look at places like LinkedIn or Facebook Marketplace, and you'll find people who are also editors. I say LinkedIn because maybe you can find some of the top book publishers and reach out to individuals who work as editors for those companies. Those people might cost a lot more than what you might get from a Fiverr, what you might get from your local writers association. But I also imagine that they might have a different level of quality and a quicker turnaround speed depending on who they are. I wanted to go back to where we started at the beginning of this video, where I mentioned all of the people who want to go out of their way to tell you just how not special you are. I think what's missing is that they forget the important part of that message, which is you don't have to be special to make really quality work. The beauty of writing is that it's a skill that can be taught. If you look at it like this gift from God with this divine purpose, if you don't feel like your work is at a certain quality, you're going to always hold that in your mind like, I'm never going to be able to do it. I just wasn't blessed with that gift. But in actuality, the more you study, the more you work on your process, the more you read other writers, you're going to find that you can still make quality work without the burden of divine purpose. Once you remove that veil of divine purpose and love and affection, when, oh man, I remember when I wrote this one line there after a week of writer's block, it's going to be a lot easier to put the knife to your work and cut out anything that is no longer benefiting your story. And once you get there, you realize that if you're not gifted, at the very least, you can still be really good.